Booktube. My name is Elizabeth. Welcome back to my channel, Bookas and Books. I am filming this video in the first week of April. That means it's the first week of the second round of the Booktube Prize, and I decided to share my thoughts on the books I have to read as I read them. Last year when I judged the Booktube Prize, I just did a wrap-up video at the end of the reading period, but I think that this time I'm going to try to vlog it just to share my thoughts as I read them. So the books I have to read, it is Group D of the Nonfiction division. So the books are Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford, Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert, Smile by Sarah Ruhl, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit, and The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. And the first book I started with was Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. I started with this one because it was available electronically from the library and I just had to click on it to read it. And also because I suspect this will not be my favorite book. It's not the genre of book I am attracted to. It is a personal memoir, and a personal memoir of growing up, and a personal memoir of a sad childhood. So all of this adds up to be a book that I am not attracted to, so I decided to start with it. So before starting reading the book, I knew that this was about the author growing up without a father because her father was in jail. So basically that is how the book is marketed. And I started reading the book, and on the very first page, the author is an adult. She lives in New York. She was raised in Indiana, so she's far away from her family. She receives a phone call from her mother and to tell her that her father is coming out of jail in 2 weeks, and that is basically the triggering event for the rest of the book. She goes back to her childhood and she talks about how she was raised and all the way up to that moment when she receives the phone call. So on the very first page, she says that she is learning to cook. And she says, to my surprise, I was not a disaster. Not it was not a disaster, I was not a disaster. And I thought, oh, no, red flag. This is a low self-esteem memoir. And then in the next sentence, there was the word therapist. Oh, God, no, not a therapy memoir. So I sort of had to tell myself, time out. It's not because it's a sort of book you don't like that it has to be at number 6 in your ranking. I'm not judging my preferences, I'm judging the quality of the book. So I had to ask myself, what do I expect from this book for it to be good? What does a memoir need to do for a memoir to be good? So I went back to a video that I had seen by Marilyn Maya Mendoza, the baby boomer booktuber, where she talked about what it takes for a memoir to be good. And in the comments and in the video, she mentions a few rules. One of the rules is that the author must not shy away from the pain. The author must be honest, and the author must hold herself accountable, basically. Sort of like if she's interviewing herself and asking the tough questions to make sure, are you telling the truth? And why is it relevant? What lessons did you learn? So basically, that's what I'm expecting from this book. I want the author to be honest. I want the author to have something somewhat to teach. Not necessarily great lessons learned, great life lessons, but it has to be about more than just her feelings. I don't want to be fed pure therapy. And she must not shy away from the difficult situations. She must have the courage to be honest about everything talked about in the book. So I thought, okay, those are the rules. And it also has to be well written and well constructed, and the same thing that I would expect from any other book. So with these rules in mind, I started to read the book, and at first I thought, wow, this is great. It is really well written, particularly in the early chapters. Some chapters about childhood are really well written, almost poetic. I'm thinking about the chapter where little 5-year-old Ashley wants to see the sunrise and she wants to catch the rising sun. And I thought that was really beautiful. And then at some point she lost me. By the last chapter, the last third of the book, I'd say, when she's in college, I thought that part was absolutely useless. I don't see why we are told about these events in college. Clearly, it's too close to her life. She is not willing to be honest about that. In the early chapters, in her early childhood, she has a very difficult childhood, so I have a lot of empathy for her, a lot of sympathy. I wanted to give a hug to that little girl. I wanted to take that little girl out of this toxic environment, because it's not just that her father wasn't there, it's that her mother was quite abusive, and she grew up in a situation where she was always in fear for her safety. She felt safe pretty much nowhere, and with reason. And we go through difficult moments with her, and in these difficult moments, I'm with her. But somewhere after that, she lost me, because it stopped being about... No, it didn't stop being anything. It never started being about anything other than the author's feelings. It's... I want to be clear, I'm not judging Ashley C. Ford herself. I'm judging the way she wrote her book. I'm judging the book. And that book is extremely self-centered. Whenever there is a secondary character, I'm going to call them that, even though they are real living people, they are talked about only when they are in the presence of Ashley Ford. Whenever they stop being important to the author, they disappear, and we just don't know what happens to them. For example, in the very, very early chapters, her little brother is very important, but then somewhere along the road, he just disappears. We basically don't know what happens to him. We don't know if he has the same recollection of their childhood as she does. We don't know how he turned out. Was he affected also by this toxic environment or not? We know nothing about that. The mother has a horrible boyfriend. We don't know what happens to the boyfriend. Is he still with the mother? Did he become a better person? Was he dumped at some point, or did he dump the mother at some point? We don't know. We don't have that information. Other information that is not given. How did the author start therapy? Because she mentions therapists more than once, and that would be relevant information. It's not mentioned at all. When she's in college, after a bad breakup, she says that she rebounded with a toxic relationship. What was that toxic relationship? No mention of it at all. Just these two words, toxic relationship, and then change the subject. And the place, the topic that I think she avoided the most was her mother. From the early chapters, we can see that the mother was abusive, and even though it's obvious that the mother loves her children because she raises them alone, she's abusive. She does not behave well, and we can call her a bad mother, I guess. But in the later chapters, it's obvious that Ashley C. Ford does not want to talk about her relationship with her mother. And I think that's the reason why the book is marketed about the absent father, and perhaps why herself, Ashley C. Ford, I'm sorry I'm saying the complete name, I have difficulty calling her just Ford, because in the book I kept seeing little girl Ashley, and I don't want to call her Ashley because I think it's disrespectful, so I'm just going to say Ashley C. Ford. So what was that? Okay, so I was saying that the reason why little Ashley C. Ford missed her father so much is, yes, because he wasn't there, but also because her mother was not enough. And had her mother been kind, and had her mother been able to keep her temper in check, had her mother not been abusive, I don't think she would have missed her father that much. And I think the interesting book would be a book about her relationship with her mother. There's a point towards the end of the book where grown-up Ashley C. Ford has a conversation with her mother, and she tells her, well, this thing happened, and the mother says that I understand why you never told me before. I was crazy back then. And I thought, okay, finally, we're going to address that. The author will talk to her mother about all of that, and there will be some sort of catharsis or something. Nothing, just change of subject, nothing to see here, and we don't go into it anymore. And I thought that would be fascinating. What made the mother say that she was crazy back then? What made her change? I suppose that she considers she's not crazy anymore, so what changed? And does she have any regret? And what is she doing to repair her relationship with her daughter? Does she think her relationship with her daughter needs repairing? Does her relationship with her other children also is affected? there are tons of things that could have been interesting, but they are simply not talked about. So if we go back to the criteria I had said at the beginning, that it needs to be relevant, it needs to be about something more than just the author's feelings. I don't want to be fed pure therapy. This is pure therapy. That I want the book that the author doesn't shy away from the difficult topics. She does shy away from some very difficult topics, which is the relationship with her mother. And yeah, so for all these reasons, I was disappointed by this book. The early chapters were wonderful, but the end was completely irrelevant, and it fell flat. So basically, she lost me at some point. So that's what I'm thinking about this book. The next book that I read is completely different. It is Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit, and I finished this one just yesterday. This book is much harder to describe. It is not a memoir, it is not a collection of essays, it is somewhat research. It is researched. Is it literary criticism? Is it nature book? A book about nature? It is a whole bunch of things. So basically, it starts with Rebecca Solnit visiting a cottage where George Orwell planted rose bushes in 1936, and that's the starting point. And from then, she just muses about all sort of things. So about Orwell himself and his life from 1936 on. So we have chapters about Orwell in Spain, chapters about Orwell writing essays about coal mining, about, what else did he write about? Oh, about political situation, because Orwell was a socialist, and about a bunch of things. Orwell's health, because he had lung disease, lung problems for a long time. And we talk about roses. So a different variety of roses, the industrial culture of roses in Colombia. We make a detour by the USSR and Stalin and lemon trees, and science under communism, and truth and newspeak, and it goes in plenty of different directions. And I have to admit that it's the sort of structure that I love. I love when a book does not necessarily go in a straight line. It is, to quote to use a word used in this book, it is rhizomatic. R-I-Z-O-M-A-T-I-C. I think I spelled it correctly. Rhizomatic. And that means it's the roots of a rose bush. They are not straight. They go in all sorts of directions, and everything is connected. And in a way, it's a bit the way the mind works. So I really enjoyed reading this book, but I wonder how I will rank it. Well, I can say right away that I rank it above Somebody's Daughter, that I know. But at the end of the month, I don't know if that book will have grown on me or if I will have forgotten it a bit. I don't know. Some chapters are stronger than others. The chapters about the industrial culture of roses in South America, that is quite strong. Chapters about the life of Orwell himself, I found them quite strong. The one that are perhaps more forgettable for me were the chapters that were perhaps more about nature writing, about gardens, about roses, and about trees, and about other things like that. So these chapters are perhaps a bit more forgettable, I think. I don't know. I finished reading this book yesterday evening, so I don't know how this book will live on in my memory. I don't know at all. So I'll be curious to see how the other books fare compared to this one. Maybe it's not a bad thing that I read this one early, because if I still have a strong memory of it in a few weeks, that means it's a very good book. But I may start to forget about it also, so that would mean it would go lower in the ranking. So I don't know. I guess it will depend on the other books. So those are the two books I have read for the moment, and I will come back when I have finished a third book. Hello again, I've just finished a third book. It is Smile, the Story of a Face by Sarah Ruhl. So this is another memoir. This one is about how Sarah Ruhl has been living for the past 10 years with Bell's palsy. That is a condition that makes half your face paralyzed. Now, of course, it's not a deadly disease, but that doesn't mean it's not a serious topic, because if you cannot use half your face, you need to relearn to do a whole bunch of things. You cannot smile anymore, so that, I guess, the reason for the title. But she had difficulty eating, difficulty speaking. She had difficulty communicating in general, because particularly in North America, perhaps in some of the cultures it's not like that, but we use smile a lot. When we meet strangers, we smile at them to signify that we're friendly and that we don't want to kill them. So we smile a lot, and it became difficult for her not to smile. And she also questions whether it's harder for women than for men, because women are expected to smile much more than men. And so I thought the topic was very interesting. My main criticism, I guess, of the book would be that it doesn't really go in depth into anything. I kind of wished some topics were treated more in depth. For example, the medical condition itself. She doesn't give a lot of information on it. I guess that we don't have that much information on it. We don't know why it's caused. Apparently there are no cures, and so I guess there is limited things that can be said, but I thought it could have been presented in a bit more in depth. Also, at some point, she has a crisis of faith. She talks about being raised Catholic and then having doubts, and then she starts being interested in Eastern religion, Buddhism in particular. It's mentioned, but it's not really treated in depth. She also turns to alternative medicine, acupuncture a lot, but also other things. She mentions it, but doesn't really go in depth into that either. So basically, there's a bit of a mushy middle. I think the beginning is quite strong when we follow her when she is pregnant, heavily pregnant with twins. She's a playwright, and at that moment, she had a play opening on Broadway, which was a very important moment in her career. And then she gives birth, and then that condition of Bell's palsy appears, and it doesn't go away. So the beginning is quite strong, and I think the end is quite strong too, because it's been 10 years and she's sort of dealing with it and reckoning with it and not trying to avoid it. And the thing is that in the middle, for a large part, she kinds of tries to avoid the issue, pretend that it's not there, that it's not that important, also what it's just appearance. And I think her attitude during these middle years is reflected a bit in the book. The middle is not as interesting as the beginning or the end. So I guess that would be my main criticism. It would be a bit of a mushy middle, a bit of a superficial treatment of certain issues. I'm not sure it would have been good if all of these issues had been examined deeply. If you dive deeply into the medical condition and then dive deeply into the crisis of faith and then dive deeply into alternative medicines, I don't think it would have been good. But at least one of these subjects could have been examined more in depth, and I think it would have given the middle part a bit more consistence. So that could have been a bit more, it's a little criticism I have. So on the whole, I quite like this book. On to the next book. Hello again. I have finished a fourth book. It is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future by Elizabeth Kolbert. As you can guess, this is a nature book. I don't know if I will have a lot to say about it. When I don't like a book, I can say generally why I don't like it, and I can pinpoint what doesn't work for me. When I like a book, I don't necessarily have a lot to say about it, and I like this book. I thought it was very interesting, I thought it was very well researched, and I thought it raised an interesting question. The main question at the heart of this book is that it's a paradox a little bit. She talks about various situations, concrete situations, where human beings, where the activities of human beings had catastrophic impact on the environment, on nature. And now we want to repair the damage by more human intervention. So this is the main idea at the heart of this book. And as I said, she raises that question, not in general, but about very specific situations. In the first section, it is about rivers in the United States, and specifically the Mississippi River in the South, where the levees that have been built to prevent flooding of inhabited areas such as New Orleans are now causing land to disappear in the southern delta because too much water is being brought in a specific place. So basically because the Mississippi is not allowed to flow as it should. And also about how the basin of the Mississippi is now linked to the basin of the Great Lakes. Naturally, they were not, but in the 19th century, a canal was built between the Illinois River and I don't know exactly which river, but a canal was built so that the Illinois River would reach the Mississippi basin instead of reaching the Great Lakes. So now there's a link between both, and the Asian carp that has now invaded all of the Mississippi is now threatening the Great Lakes. And she talks about all of the various efforts that are made to try to prevent this carp from reaching the Great Lakes, and how some initiatives are maybe not that good or not that efficient, or basically how we are trying to dig ourselves out of a hole. And then in the second part, it is more about the extinction of certain species, about fish in one lake in the desert. That is quite interesting, about coral. And then there is the last chapter is about global warming, I would say. Efforts that are being made to save the planet, I guess, from global warming. Efforts are being made. They're not really being made. At the moment, there are more being thought about and experimented on a very, very small scale, or it's more theoretical than concrete. But anyway, so on the whole, I thought it was a very interesting book, and I really liked it. My one little, perhaps maybe thing that I didn't like is the fact that there is no introduction. So before starting reading the book, I didn't know what it was about because it's a book for the Booktube Prize. I have to read it, and I did not bother to read the flap or the back of the book. So I had no idea what it was about, and there's no introduction to tell me what it would be about. In novels, I don't mind. It's normal not to know what's going to happen. But in nonfiction, I like to have a general idea. I like to have a plan of some sort of basically telling me what the book is about, what's the main thesis or what the main subject of the book. So that's the one little thing I didn't like. I wish was different, I guess. But on the whole, I really like this book. So now I have 2 books left. I'll talk to you soon. Hello again, I have finished another book. It is The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan. This is a collection of essays, 6 essays about sex and feminism. I won't talk about each of them. First things first, I liked the book. I liked it more than I thought I would. I don't know why. I was not expecting much from it, but I ended up liking it quite a bit, and perhaps because I was engaged with it. I was sort of discussing with the author what she was saying. I won't talk about every essay. I will just mention one that I didn't like, one that I absolutely, completely liked and agreed with, and a bone to pick with her choice of words. So 3 things. One I didn't like is the second one, which is on pornography. She teaches, Srinivasan teaches a class at Oxford University, philosophy, ethics, feminism, I don't know exactly what it is, about pornography. And in that chapter, I felt a bit like the ball in a pinball machine, like being sent right and left. One moment she talks about the opinion of one of her students, the next moment she takes an example from Facebook or from Twitter, and then the next moment she talks about a conference in the 1970s, and then she's back to her students and back to quoting some feminist texts from before. And so I felt a bit dizzy by all of this back and forth. And also I was wondering, why does she chooses these particular elements to build her essay? Particularly the opinion of her students, because her students are at Oxford, which is in and of itself a privileged place. So can we assume that these students at Oxford are representative of their generation? Can they really speak for all 20 years old today? I don't think they can. So that one was a little bit, I didn't like that one as much. One that I absolutely, completely and totally agreed with. It's probably the shortest, and it's probably the least, the one that required the least research. It is the one about not sleeping with your students. Of course, she talks about university teachers. She's not talking about high school teachers. And there are a lot of questions about how we or universities should regulate the relations between their teachers and their students, because the students are adults. In case of doctorate studies or postgraduate studies, the students are in their mid-20s. So they are adults, their brains are fully formed, and they are able to make decisions. So why should universities come in between teachers and students and decide what their relationships can and cannot be? Srinivasan suggests, and I completely agree with it, that instead of trying to regulate behaviors based on rights, why don't we base it on duties and obligation, and mainly the obligations and duties of a teacher? If the teacher's duties are to teach every student equally, is it a breach of that duty if he or she sleeps with one of the students? If the teacher's duty is to create an environment where every student will feel comfortable and will be able to learn as much as they can, is it fostering that sort of environment if the teacher considers the students as a pool of potential mates? So I thought that was just plain common sense. I hope every university will just adhere to that and define the relations between teachers and students, not in terms of rights, but in terms of obligations and duties. Now, that leads us to the thing I do not agree with, the word that I do not agree with, and that is the word right. The right to sex. So in that essay, The Right to Sex, that one was published in the London Review of Books before being published in this book. And in that essay, Srinivasan sort of discusses the question of right to sex, because it has come at the forefront with the incel movement. These men, generally white men, frustrated men who do not get sex and who think they are owed sex and should receive sex because it's a basic need and they're allowed to have it and that sort of thing. So of course, sex is a basic need. Everybody has hormones, everybody has a libido. So sex is a right, but at the same time, nobody should be forced to provide sex. So there's no such thing as being obliged to give sex, as the duty of sex. So in the essay, Srinivasan does not conclude anything. She leaves it open like this, that yes, sex is a basic need, but no, nobody owes sex to anyone. And of course, that caused reactions, and she wrote another essay, that is the fourth essay in this book, which comes right after The Right to Sex, where she sort of goes further in her thinking and reacts to the reaction. And in this particular essay, the paragraphs are numbered, so I can pinpoint you exactly to the sentence that I do not agree with. Well, two sentences, in fact. It's it's chapter 4. It's the fourth essay, the coda, and it's paragraph number 4. And the sentence is, "There is no right to sex, period." Parenthesis. "To think otherwise is," emphasis on is, "to think like a rapist." End of parenthesis, close parenthesis. And I disagree with that sentence. I understand what she's trying to say. Nobody owes sex to anyone. There's no such thing as a duty to give sex, as an obligation to give sex. That doesn't exist. However, the right to sex, that is not what it means, in my opinion. The right to sex does not mean that you get to be gratified every time you think about it or you want it. And there is such a thing as a right to sex. I don't want to be too legalistic about it, but in the legal world, right, there are two types of rights, and it depends on the type of obligation they create on the part of someone else. For example, the right to life, it's a very basic right, yet nobody really owes you life. You don't get immortality because you have the right to life. People die, and the doctors cannot do what nature does not allow them to do. So yeah, it doesn't create any obligation on anybody's part except to abstain from killing you. So it doesn't create an obligation to do something, it creates an obligation not to do something on the part of other people. A right that does create an obligation to do something would be the right to vote. I'm 18 years old, I'm a Canadian citizen, I have the right to vote in Canadian elections. But for me to be able to do that, the government has to provide me the occasion and the means to do that. So in that case, there is an obligation to provide something. They must provide first the election, and second the polls and the little slips of paper and the pencil to mark the paper and everything. They have to provide me the means of exercising my right to vote. So there is this second type of right. And what Srinivasan means is that the right to sex is not the second type of right. It's not the right that forces somebody else to give you it. But there is a right to sex. And I'm thinking of a situation. For example, suppose that you have severe physical disability and you live in a medical institution, and it's going to be like that for the rest of your life. And in that institution, you need help to get dressed, to bathe, perhaps to eat. But that doesn't mean you don't have a brain. It doesn't mean you don't have a body. And you have a visitor one day, and you're very friendly with that visitor, and you and your visitor decide to have sex. So the visitor, who is perfectly able-bodied, decides to close the door, and you go on to have sex together. And now a nurse comes in and sees you and says, no, 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 none of this in our establishment. It's against the rule. Well, you probably could sue the establishment for a right to sex because it is one of your basic needs. You are between two consenting adults. There is no reason why the establishment should prevent you from having sex because you're stuck there for the rest of your life. They cannot force you to celibacy. So there is such a thing as a right to sex. However, the guy across the room, I'm saying the guy or the girl, the person across the room who does not have any visitors, who does not have any close friends, supposing that person hears that you won your case against the establishment and that you have a right to sex, and that person across the hall asks the nurse for a sexual favor because I have a right to sex too. No, that person would be in the wrong because there's no obligation to provide it. So in that, I agree, there's no obligation whatsoever to be forced to have sex, to provide sex. There's no such thing as an obligation to provide sex, but there is a right to sex. And that could also mean that for members of the LGBTQ spectrum or people who have sexual activities that are not within the average or within the norm. I don't want to go too much into that, but suppose that you want something that is more than the average sexual act. And you live in a place where you're the only one who wants that. There's no one else who wants the same thing as you want. You cannot force anyone to have it, and yet you still have the right to perform it. If you find willing partners, you have the right to perform sex the way you want it performed, and the other person, consenting adults, basically. So there cannot be any rules that would exactly regulate what sort of sex you're allowed to have. We think obviously of heterosexual versus lesbian, gay, and anything else, but it could also eventually be sex within marriage or outside of marriage, or sex particular practices or something like that, particular fetishes that would be forbidden or things like that. And in modern society, North American, British societies, you could probably go to court if anybody tried to prevent you the right to have that. The possibility of having that type of sex, you could probably sue and you probably win. So there is such a thing as a right to sex. So that's why I don't like the way the word right is used throughout this book. The idea, however, is clear. There's no confusion as to what Srinivasan is trying to say. It's clear that she's saying that there's no obligation to provide sex, and that the incels who say I have a right to sex, which means in their mind they have a right to rape, it doesn't exist. Obviously, there's no right to rape, but there is a right to sex. So that's my little bone to pick with that book. However, it is still very, very good, and I am really wondering how I will rank these books. It's going to be very difficult to rank all 5 of them. Hello again. I have finished the 6th book I had to read. It is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. In this book, the author goes to various places in the United States that have a link with slavery. So he goes to plantations, he goes to a cemetery, he goes to a couple of cities, New York and Galveston, and he listens to what is being said about slavery. So basically, he goes on touristic tours to listen to how slavery is talked about and how it's presented. And I thought this was very, very interesting. there's one little thing that puzzles me, I guess. In the middle chapter, he goes to a cemetery. It's Blandford Cemetery, and it's a Confederate cemetery. And there he goes to a ceremony hosted by some sort of organization that claims to have nothing to do with white supremacy, but in fact has a little bit something to do with white supremacy. Most of the people he talked to at that ceremony said that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. And they claim that there's not a single document, and there's not a single book of history, of accurate history, that will tell you that the Civil War was linked to slavery. So, of course, Clint Smith has no difficulty at all debunking that myth. He just quotes the Declaration of Secession by various states, and slavery is right there, generally in the first couple of lines. So there's not a shadow of a doubt that the Civil War was about slavery. So he talks to these people who are in somewhat of a denial. And then in the last chapter, he goes to Africa. He goes to Gorée Island in Senegal, and he visits what is called the House of Slaves. And the story of the House of Slaves is that it was a place where millions of Africans were stored, if I can use that horrible word, were kept before they were being shipped to America. Or the Americas, not necessarily the United States, but before they were shipped to the Americas, and that they went through the door of no return. And there are some pictures of that door that you can find easily on the internet. It's like this big U-shape opening that looks onto the sea. However, research has shown that these claims are quite exaggerated. The door of no return probably was never used as a door for people. It was probably more an opening to throw garbage straight into the water. And it probably was not millions of Africans who went through that house. It was in the tens of thousands, so 30 to 50,000, something like that. But the guide at the house said that, does it really matter? Do the facts really matter? Is the fiction more important than reality? And in a way, Clint Smith seems to accept it. I say in a way because it's not obvious. The obviousness is in fact in a preceding chapter. It is in the chapter on Galveston. When he's in Galveston, he participates in a recreation of the famous reading of the proclamation that all slaves were free on June 19, 1865. So what became Juneteenth? And in the very first paragraph of that chapter, there's a sentence that says, though there are no contemporary accounts of that happening. So there are no contemporary accounts of General Granger reading that proclamation from that specific balcony. And yet it is being reenacted as though it is history. And on the next page, Clint Smith says, I felt history pulsing through my veins. So in a way, in that sentence, I consider him as adopting the idea that historical fiction that is sincere may be as valid as the plain facts, which is obviously nonsense. Otherwise, the people that he talked to in the Confederate cemetery would also be right. If truth is a feeling, anything can be historical truth. So it bothered me a little bit, this contradiction. So now that I have read all 6 books, I want to rank them. In fact, I finished reading this over a week ago, and now it's almost 2 weeks ago, but I still haven't submitted my ranking because it's very difficult. It's the first time it's happening to me. It happened to me in the previous round. I always had at least a top 3 or bottom 3, or at worst a top 2, middle 2, bottom 2. But this time I struggled. Now I think I came up with something, and I want to submit my ballot in front of you. So I have my trusty iPad here. I will just log into my account. So now that I have logged into my account, I can do my ranking. So the problem I had with this round was that I had a clear number 1 and, in my opinion, a clear number 6. And everything in the middle, I didn't really know how to rank it. And over the past week, the past 10 days that have elapsed since I finished reading How the Word is Passed, I sort of tried in my head different rankings and see if it sat well with me. And I ended up with a ranking that I think satisfies me. So I'm just going to input it in front of you. And then before I submit, I'll sort of pause just to make sure. So the one that for me is definitely at number 6 is Somebody's Daughter by Ashley Ford. The reason I put it at number 6 is that I think it's the one that is not succeeding at doing what it pretends to do, what it purports to do. It pretends to be a memoir about growing up without a father, and that's not it. It's a memoir about growing up in an abusive home. The real problem is not the absence of the father, it's the abusive mother. And that issue is completely circumvented. And also I found that the final chapters were quite useless. I didn't see the point of going with her to university, and I thought that many issues were just somewhat mentioned so that we know they existed, but they were not explained, they were not examined, they were not part of the memoir. So that's the reason I put number 6, and perhaps also as a message to publishers, stop giving memoir contracts to 28 years old. They don't have the distance necessary to write memoirs. So I say 28 years old. I don't know how old Ashley C. Ford is, but I'm pretty sure she was not 30 when she got the book contract. So yeah, so that one is at number 6. Okay, and then at number 5, I will, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to put Smile by Sarah Ruhl. And the reason I put it at number 5, it's because it's already fading a bit in my memory. Of the 6 books, it's the one that I remember the least, and it's probably going to be one that I will quite soon forget, unfortunately. So I don't think it is as powerful as some of the others. So I put that one at number 5. Okay, now that's the real difficulty, actually, the numbers 2 to 4. So at number 4, I decided to put The Right to Sex by Amia Srinivasan. It is a very good book. I think it's a book I will reread. But the reason I put it at number 4, I don't know if there's a specific reason I put it at number 4. The reason is that, as I said, I don't quite agree with her use of the word right. I think it may mean multiple things and she doesn't quite clarify what meaning she is using it in. And also perhaps the fact that they are distinct essays and perhaps are not quite enough linked together. So for these little things, I decided to put it at number 4. At number 3, I will put How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And at number 2, I will put, Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit. That one, I'm a bit surprised of putting it at number 2. Can I surprise myself like that? I think I can. After finishing reading that book, I was wondering how well I would remember that book, how it would stay with me. Because of the 6 books I had to read for this round, it's clearly the one with the lightest subject. It doesn't deal with abuse, it doesn't deal with slavery, it doesn't deal with sexual assault, it doesn't deal with anything particularly serious. It talks about George Orwell as a writer and roses and plants and things like that. But I found myself thinking back to that book more than once since I finished reading it. And I'm sure I will reread that book. I'm quite happy to have bought a copy of it because I know I will go back to it. So I put it at number 2. And the one that I put at number 1 is Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert. Now, this is the book about not climate change, but about environment and how human intervention in the environment causes disasters, and how we are now trying to mitigate our intervention, to mitigate the consequences of our intervention, but we are trying to do that by doing more intervention. So I think it raises very interesting questions, and there was not a single part of that book I didn't like. If I remember well, my only caveat was the fact that there was no introduction. And I don't care about the fact that there's no introduction. I think it's a wonderful book. So I put that one at number 1. So I'm just rereading before I click submit. And so that means 1, Under a White Sky, 2, Orwell's Roses, 3, How the Word is Passed, 4, The Right to Sex, 5, Smile, 6, Somebody's Daughter. So yeah, I'm going to go with that. I have to admit that the order, particularly of 2, 3, and 4, could have changed on a different day. It was something different a couple of days ago, and it was something different 3 or 4 days ago, and it changed a lot over the past 10 days. But I think that is the order with which I'm comfortable at the moment. Maybe when the video will come out, I will not be comfortable with it anymore. I don't know. So that's it. Save ballot. Your ballot has been saved. And that is it. I have voted. So I will end this video here, and I will film and post a separate reaction video. So this will be ready to go live as soon as Robert finishes the announcement of which books go through to the semifinals. So thank you everyone for watching. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you thought about them. I'm very curious about that. And I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!